All right, let's just jump right in. We all like to think we're pretty rational people, right? That we make logical choices. But what if I told you that your mind is actually designed to make mistakes? And not just random mistakes, but predictable ones. And that understanding why you make them is the secret to a smarter life? Okay, take a quick look at this. It's a classic puzzle. Don't overthink it. Just go with the very first answer that pops into your head. Ready? You got it? If you thought 10 cents, hey, you are in very good company. That is the answer that our fast, intuitive brain spits out almost instantly. It feels right, doesn't it? But it's wrong. The actual answer is 5 cents. Think about it. A 5-cent ball and a bat that costs $1 more would be $1.05. Together, that's $1.10. The reason our brain gets this wrong, though, reveals this fundamental battle that's happening inside our heads every single day. It's a clash between how we should think and how we actually do. You see, for a long time, classical economics was built on this idea of the econ, this imaginary, perfectly rational being. But as behavioral economists like Richard Thaler have shown us, we are not econs, not even close. We are humans. We're emotional, we're inconsistent, we're often surprisingly generous. We're just operating with a totally different set of rules. The brilliant work of psychologist Daniel Kahneman gives us a way to think about this. He says our minds have two systems. System one is your gut reaction. That's the system that screamed 10 cents. It's fast, it's automatic. Then there's system two. That's our slow, deliberate, analytical thinking. It's the part of our brain that can actually do the math and find the right answer, if we bother to switch it on. The thing is, most of our irrationality comes from letting system one run the show. So let's see these two systems go head to head. First up, how do we decide what something is actually worth? Well, it turns out it is not nearly as logical as you'd think. So, in this famous experiment, Kahneman and his colleagues gave these simple coffee mugs to one group of students, but not to another. Then, they tried to create a little marketplace. They asked the owners to name the lowest price they'd sell for, and they asked the buyers to name the highest price they'd be willing to pay. And the result was just staggering. The owners, on average, wouldn't sell their mug for less than about $5. But the buyers, they would only pay around $2.50. That's a 2-to-1 difference. We're talking about the exact same mug, but just the act of owning it literally made it twice as valuable in people's minds. This is what's called the endowment effect. So, why? What's going on here? Well, it all comes down to a super powerful bias called loss aversion. Here's the deal. Psychologically, the pain of losing something is about twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining that exact same thing. So for the mug owners, giving it up feels like a loss, which hurts way more than the pleasure a buyer would get from gaining it. Now, this fear of loss leads us into another really common mistake. Richard Thaler tells this great story about his friend who paid for an expensive tennis club membership and then immediately got a bad case of tennis elbow. So instead of resting, he kept playing through the pain for months. Why? Because he just couldn't stand the thought of wasting the membership fee. This is the classic sunk cost fallacy. That money for the membership, it was a sunk cost. It was gone forever, whether he played or not. The only rational choice was to stop and let his arm heal. But his human brain, the one that's terrified of loss, just couldn't let it go. It felt like he was losing the money all over again. Come on, we've all done this, right? You're halfway through a terrible movie, the money for the ticket is gone, your time would be so much better spent just leaving and doing anything else. But our aversion to wasting that money, to just accepting the loss, it keeps us glued to our seats. That is system one completely overriding common sense. And this brings us to our next point. It's not just how we value things that's irrational. Our choices can be completely flipped by something as simple as the words used to describe them. This is called framing. Okay, imagine a crisis. There are 600 people at risk. You have to make a choice. Here's option A, a program that will save 200 lives for sure. Now, how about this choice? A program where 400 people will definitely die. Which one feels better to you? Which one do you pick? Here's the crazy part. They are the exact same outcome. Saving 200 out of 600 is identical to 400 out of 600 dying. But when the choice is framed as a gain, saving lives, people tend to play it safe and choose the sure thing. But when it's framed as a loss, people dying, our loss aversion kicks in, and suddenly we become risk takers to try and avoid that certain loss.
Our minds also get stuck on the very first number we hear about something. This is a bias called anchoring. In one wild study, people were asked if the percentage of African nations in the UN was higher or lower than a totally random number spun on a wheel of fortune. And guess what? Their final estimate was massively influenced by that completely arbitrary number. The first number they saw anchored their final guess, even though it meant nothing.
So, if we know our brains are filled with all these glitches and bugs, can we actually use that knowledge to our advantage? Absolutely. We can design systems and choices that work with our rational human nature instead of fighting against it. Take dieting, for example. As the author Dan Ariely points out, dieting is actually way harder than quitting smoking. Think about it. With smoking, you just stop. You're a non-smoker. But you can't just stop eating. You have to make dozens of food choices every single day. And each choice uses up a little bit of your willpower, totally exhausting your slow, deliberate system too. So the solution is to make it easier for our lazy brains. Don't just rely on willpower. It's a terrible strategy. First, just remove the choice. If there's no cake in the house, you can't eat cake. Simple. Second, create really simple, strict rules, like no dessert on weekdays, period. This offloads the decision from that overworked System 2 and turns it into a simple, automatic rule for System 1 to follow. It makes success way more likely. Look, understanding these quirks of our minds, it isn't just some fun intellectual exercise. It really changes how we see ourselves. If our choices about life and death, about money and happiness, can be swayed by something as small as the framing of a question, it forces us to ask a much bigger one. How much control do we really have? And maybe more importantly, how can we start designing a world that helps our inner human make the choices our inner econ would actually approve of?